So now that we've covered the concept of burst weapons, in this video we'll be creating the weapon burst class, so we'll have our first burst weapon that we can use on ships. By the end of this video, we will have a functioning weapon. So let's go ahead and get started.
All right, let's begin at the game folder, and let's add a new item. This item will be a weapon burst. Inside of weapon burst, we'll spend just a brief moment, clean up some of the namespacing, and I believe just the subnamespace alone is enough. Now, the weapon burst itself is going to directly extend weapon. So we'll make sure we drop that in. We've got our class together. Now there are some fields that we'll need to put into place in order to track everything. First, we will need a timer and a queue value. That will make up our virtual queue. Let me get those dropped in place. The timer is simply the mechanism that allows the subsequent firings, meaning after you press the fire button, you get your first projectile. It will actually be controlled by a timer in a similar sense to an automatic weapon, in that you press, or after one press, a timer will fire subsequent times. So we are going to have a timer. We're also going to have a queue value. So I'll put integer queue and grab some spelling, and now we've got integer queue. Again, this establishes what I'm going to term our virtual queue, meaning that it is a value that I will initialize, or rather establish, and then eat away at over time, and I'll simply use it as a value to tell when I have run out of something. This is opposed to maybe an actual queue that you put items into, like a list. We're going to have two more fields that are going to be held inside of burst weapon, and these will be burst total and fire interval. These are both going to be protected, as they may be useful to any descending class of weapon burst. So first one is protected integer burst total. And again, this simply tells us how many projectiles do we need to fire in each burst, or in each actual firing of the weapon. We're also going to have a protected double value to control our fire interval. And while at a glance that might seem redundant to do here as well as in Weapon Auto, there are very good reasons for having the fire interval separately, simply because we'll be counting down against time using the queue to very closely track things. So, moving on, we can now address the constructor for the burst weapon. So public weapon burst is going to take in, beginning with a ship. It is then going to require a fire interval, so we'll give a double parameter, and that will be fire interval. And then we have the remaining value, and that is to say what is the burst total for this weapon. So we'll give an integer for burst total. And after all these, we can make our call to the base constructor pass along ship for the base weapon. And then we're ready for the constructor body. We'll begin by simply initializing burst total and fire interval, the instanced fields. Burst total being equal to the burst total parameter that's being fed in. And then the same for fire interval, which will be equal to, again, fire interval. Now we need to set up our timer, that is, we need to instantiate it, and we need to set up an event handler. So we'll say this.timer is equal to a new instance of timer. And then we grab a terminator, and then we can move on to our timer's fire event. We will subscribe to that event. I'll hit tab to drop in a new notify handler, and then the name of timer_fire is fine, so I'll hit tab again. We'll drop in our actual handler method. And I'll actually leave this method alone for the time being. We'll get back to the timer's fire because it really does help to follow the code in the actual progression that firing will take place in. So we'll leave fire timer alone for a minute, and we'll turn our attention to start fire. We'll override the weapon start fire, and inside of start fire we need to do a few things. Some things similar to an automatic weapon, but we also have to keep in mind our queue value. And we'll begin with a check that allows us to control the fire rate so that the fire rate cannot be exceeded by pressing the fire button faster than the fire interval. This is accomplished by doing a check on the queue before allowing firing to happen. The check is to make sure that the Q is equal to a value of 0. And by Q, we mean the virtual queue of projectiles that have yet to be spawned. If this value is at 0, that means we have no projectiles waiting. Or in another sense, we're not firing. We've either finished firing or have not fired yet. In either case, it is okay to begin firing again. So the very first thing we'll do is we'll throw a value into the queue. We'll set this.q equal to this weapon's burst total. And that way, again, burst total will survive, of course, across multiple firings of the weapon. So we simply reset our queue to burst total whenever we begin a volley or a burst of firing. The next thing we'll do is we'll make an immediate call to the fire method. And once again, this is just to give the expected weapon responsiveness of pressing the fire button immediately results in something happening. Once we have done our initial fire, we will start our timer. So timer.start, the interval is going to be given by our own fire interval field. So with that, again, somewhat similar to an automatic weapon, but we have some checks in place to control fire rate, and we're also setting up the value in the queue to be later decremented or eaten away at as time goes by. Now we can actually turn our attention over to our timer fire handler. What we need to do in here is every time the timer fires, we need to decrement the number in the queue, then check that number to see, one, if the number is high enough that we can still fire, or if it has become low enough that we need to turn the timer off. So first thing that we'll do is we'll take this.q and we will decrement it. Then we'll turn around and check the value of q. So if q is greater than 0, meaning that if we have not yet run out of projectiles to fire, call the fire method. Then we'll put in an else clause saying that if there were no projectiles left to fire because of this last decrement, then disable the timer. So we'll tell this.timer to stop. So just a few lines of code, but to reiterate one last time, this, or rather to simply follow it end to end, that means that if start fire is pressed, Q hasn't been used yet, so it's 0. We dump the overall total into the queue, make a call to fire, and then start running our timer. So simple enough up to that point. Now every time the timer fires, we first decrement Q to get to an accurate position, the accurate step in the burst overall. Then if that Q is greater than 0, that indicates that we have a projectile left to spawn. So we call fire. If we have, because of this decrement, reached 0, then we disable the timer. And the key thing here about both of these, the way the numbers are initialized and the checks are done, is we actually have to wait out a full interval of the timer before we're allowed to refire. That means, for example, after, let's say, Q coming into here was all the way down to 1, we decrement, or excuse me, was all the way down to 2, we decrement it to 1, we fire, and then we have to wait a full timer interval before we decrement and realize that it's 0. So that gives us that final wait period that enforces a smooth, continuous fire rate. Now, with all of that in place, I believe we should be ready for testing. So in order to test this, let's bring up our player ship class. Inside of player ship, let's change our weapon to be a weapon burst. I'm going to retain some of the fields that were originally used to configure the wave weapon, because again, this is the goal that we're working towards, to reestablish our wave firing abilities, but to do so leveraging the burst weapon. But let me bring up the parameters, and we'll see which ones of these we can still use. We still use fire interval, and we can still use wave fire total. We'll simply set that for our burst total. For the time being, we'll have to wipe out the wave fire spread because a basic burst weapon has no concept of wave spread. So with this, let's build, and let's test it out. So if we press the fire button once, a series of 4 projectiles have been spawned. So once again, let me think. There's 2 more things that I would like to show. I'm just pausing a moment to decide which would be most appropriate. First, let's cover the fact that it's now become very difficult to maintain a continuous stream of fire. If I press once, that's all very smooth. But if I keep pressing the fire button over and over again, you'll notice that sometimes you get a long series of fires, but sometimes there's a lot of time in between. What this means is that in order to maintain a smooth stream of firing, you would have to, by your own, learn the overall interval of the total burst and make sure you press the button at just the right time so that as one burst was ending, you've hit the fire again at the right moment. In order to make this a little bit more friendly, what we can do is we can actually allow the queue to go beyond the burst total. And as long as we go beyond the burst total in multiples of an entire burst, then we'll simply play those back out. This allows us to simply stack the idea of multiple bursts onto one fire. What this will allow us to do is if we manage to press the fire button twice before the fire burst actually elapses, we'll actually go ahead and stack a whole nother burst onto the queue before we run out. What that means is as long as you can press the button faster than the overall burst, then you can maintain a perfectly smooth, continuous stream of fire. So to put this into action, what we do is we would go into start fire, and if our queue was not at 0, meaning we would otherwise not allow a start fire, we will do one further check. We'll do an else if, and we'll say else if, and then check to see if the queue is less than the burst total. So if this dot queue is less than this dot burst total. This means that at least one projectile has in fact been fired. Really, with the queue being decremented, it means at least one timer hit has elapsed. So if we have allowed at least one timer hit, then we'll say that you are now allowed to press the button again to queue up another full burst of fire. And in order to queue up a full burst, we simply take queue at whatever value it might be and add one whole burst total worth of, I want to say projectiles, but really it's virtual. It's just a number incremented by that amount. Or this dot queue plus equals this dot burst total. Now this seems it might seem dodgy at first because you think, well, we don't know what queue is necessarily. All we've said that is the timer has to have elapsed once. That means the queue could be 3, it could be 2, it could be 1. There's a lot of different possible values for a queue. But keep in mind that we're incrementing by an entire wave. So it doesn't matter if we're on the last element possible. If our queue is all the way down to 1 and we add a full burst total, that 1 is going to elapse and then we have another full burst. So everything still stays even in the end in the visual effect. Now we'll test this out and make sure that as long as we press the button fast enough, so if we press the button really very fast twice, we get 8 projectiles perfectly spaced. And if we continuously press the button, we can see that it is now possible with a rather inaccurate timing on our button presses to maintain a smooth and continuous fire. So while the burst weapon does require the fire button to be repressed, we've now made it so that it's more user-friendly. So you feel like you're firing a smooth, continuous volley of projectiles even though you might be sporadically slamming the button. One last thing to prove, because one last goal of the burst fire weapon was to make sure that the fire interval was enforced, meaning that if you press the button faster, you don't have the fire interval exceeded. To simulate this, we can load up our player class and simply re-enable our line where we are calling the ship start fire before we check any actual inputs. The moment we notice we have a ship in player, just call the ship's start fire. And we get an automatically firing ship, but you'll notice that the projectiles are still spawning at the same increment spacing. We have not been able to exceed the fire rate. So that means our burst weapon has been very successful, one in first providing burst style fire, but it also provides enforcement for the fire interval. So let me turn off that quick test mode. And with that really has the weapon burst covered.
Okay, and with that is going to wrap up this video. Thanks a lot.